Something that really brings my piss to a boil is how much people try to smear the expanded universe. We all know the cliches: Skippy the droid being mistaken for a canon story, Mount Sorrow, which was featured in a comic based on a children's cartoon in the 80s, and was contextualized afterwards by Leland Chee. But one of the most common ways people shit on the expanded universe is through the Force Unleashed. And that leads me to the comment that inspired me to make this video in the first place. There was this douchebag named Jayhorn Nakik, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who commented on my Fallen Order review talking shit about the Force Unleashed. He said, and I quote,
"I've never played the Force Unleashed, but I've heard enough about it to know it doesn't sound like a good game. Any game where you play a random Sith/Jedi/whatever and are able to literally defeat Darth Vader is fan fiction. Fallen Order does this right. You have no chance against Vader, and you shouldn't. The databank entry you get for him after escaping him literally says, escape is your only chance of survival. And someone that can use the Force to literally pull a Star Destroyer from the sky into the ground? Oh, please."
Then, despite whatever I told him, he kept laughing me off, clearly not caring about context. Like, he just compared Starkiller, the literal apprentice of Darth Vader, who he was training under for as long as possible within the time span of Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, to a character like Cal Kestis, who was established as having incomplete training, and then having to lax his Force use after Order 66, and spends the entire game remembering and reconnecting his affinity to the Force. Maybe you should actually play the Force Unleashed instead of incorrectly labeling Starkiller as a random character. Which tells me that he's completely oblivious to one of the main selling points of the game. That this is the untold story of Darth Vader's secret apprentice. If anything, Cal Kestis is the random Jedi, who was made up on the spot to create his own self-contained story. So this guy expresses a lot of other stupid misconceptions about a game he hasn't even played. Yet he has this air of cocky arrogance that he knows what he's talking about. When I pointed out that he hasn't even played the goddamn game, he responded with,
"Spoiler. You don't have to have played a game to know that it's bad. That's the whole ideas of reviews and word of mouth from other people."
Okay, this really confuses me. Who in the hell has talked crap about The Force Unleashed as a game? The Force Unleashed is an awesome game. Everywhere I look, it's praised out the arse. The only complaints I've heard come from like the Steam version where people complained about the PC version's performance being bad. But when it comes to the actual game, when it functions, it's unending fun that told the ambitious story of Darth Vader's secret apprentice. I always return to it on occasion because it's so much fun. So now I wanted to debunk every misconception this guy brings up in a structured order. The main vibe of his argument was pointing out stuff that happens in the game's campaign with zero context and being like, lol, that's so bad and dumb. So I wanted to go through The Force Unleashed and discuss how a lot of ways those critical of the game think about the story are extremely stupid. They seem to miss the fact that the game is called The Force Unleashed and is very obviously an over-the-top version of how the Force is used. When you see the gameplay of Starkiller effortlessly throw stormtroopers around like it's nothing, that's a gameplay gimmick only. Starkiller obviously did not just pull down a Star Destroyer because he's just so powerful and godlike or whatever. The way the gameplay functions is not canonical. But despite the game being called The Force Unleashed and being deliberately so over the top and ridiculous with the gameplay, people take it incredibly literally and it's fucking annoying. The Force Unleashed the game is not how you experience the canonical version of the story. You want to read the novelization. Any expanded universe fan will tell you that, including me, especially after giving it a read myself. Now, when I directed him to the novelization for the canon version of events, he used that classic, "I shouldn't have to read a book to understand the game" excuse and completely missed the point. So normally I would say that too, in regards to the film novelizations, since they should always be optional to the film experience. But the difference is, the Force Unleashed game and novel are on equal footing with each other. They're both a part of the expanded universe, which is an optional way to experience Star Wars after you're done with the movies. The Force Unleashed is not required homework any more than the novel is. Plus, in case you forgot, the game has obviously exaggerated gameplay and is not entirely canonical. I know the novel says The Force Unleashed too, but let me tell you that the novel does everything and anything but unleash the Force to the ridiculous degree the game does. You see, it's a bit different. While the movie always overrides the novelization of The Force Unleashed is commonly agreed to override the game. I accept the novelization as the canonical version of the story, and the game is just the version that tells the story with exaggerated gameplay. It's also worth noting that the Force Unleashed game is not actually one single game. It's actually around 5, if not more. The one I've been showing the whole time is the high definition version released on the current gen systems of the time, including PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC. Then you've got the standard definition version, released for the PlayStation 2 and Nintendo Wii, and later re-released for the Nintendo Switch. Then after that, you've got the Nintendo DS version, which is also its own unique game. Then you've got a few miscellaneous versions of the game released for iOS and J2ME and so on and so forth. There's a bunch of different versions of the Force Unleashed in game form, and let me tell you, they all have differences from each other. Not just in gameplay, but in how the story is presented. They might have different levels, but they all tell the same basic story. In the first level alone, between the HD and SD versions, there's a bunch of differences. The most obvious to point out is that the HD version takes place during the day, and the SD version at night time. The commander that speaks to Vader is completely different in both versions. In the HD version, it's this old Imperial officer guy, and in the SD version, it's a stormtrooper. The SD version adds levels that take place on Coruscant absent from the HD version, unless you count the Coruscant mission DLC, but that came out after. And I recall the SD version has an exclusive mission to save Garmbel Iblis. So yeah, saying that the game is the definitive version is flawed logic, because in case you didn't know, there's at least 5 different versions of The Force Unleashed that are all video games. Which one is the correct version? My answer is that none of them are. The novelization is the most canonical version, and that also comes with changes from all the versions of the game. It wasn't just adapting one game, it was adapting multiple games that all have differences from each other. I think when people think of The Force Unleashed as one definitive game, they think of the HD version and nothing else. I don't know why they'd suddenly forget about the SD version, given it was re-released for the Switch, but that's how ignorant people can be. So the thing is, the novelization is not covering plot holes to excuse the game, because as I pointed out, it was adapting numerous different games that all have differences from each other. And second of all, every game version of The Force Unleashed is obviously not to be taken literally. The HD version is over the top, the SD version is over the top, the DS version is over the top, and so on, you get the point. On top of all that, I also wanted to talk about the Shadows of the Empire multimedia project, which assists my argument. Shadows of the Empire was a story adapted in different mediums. There was the most well-known version, the video game, released for the Nintendo 64 and PC, then there's the novel, and then there's the comics, and so on and so forth. The multimedia project also wasn't just the story, but trading cards and action figures. On a similar basis, The Force Unleashed was also one big multimedia project. That's why you had different versions of The Force Unleashed that were all video games plus a novelization. So yeah, to recap, the excuse that the novelization is a lazy cop-out that explains the plot holes of the game is stupid, because there's numerous different games that the novelization was adapting at the same time. The games are obviously not supposed to be taken literally, but people still do for whatever reason, and the ignorance of the fact that The Force Unleashed was one big multimedia project with different versions of essentially the same story. I should also mention now that there's a Force Unleashed comic, but that's a story for another day. Now let's go through the novelization and explain what really happened. I'm going to compare the novelization to the game most people think of, the HD version, and dispute a lot of misconceptions about the story of the Force Unleashed. So the first level of the game is actually a flashback in the structure of the novel, with Starkiller remembering his traumatic suppressed memory of Darth Vader killing his father and taking him in as his apprentice. Since we all know Darth Vader is the peak Jedi Hunter, there's no supposed plot holes here to explain. Second level, Darth Vader sends his apprentice on his first Jedi hunting mission. The novel goes over a bit what his training was like, and Vader was a hard-ass mentor. And the first time he actually referred to Starkiller as an apprentice is right here, or at least the parallel version of it the book presents. He's sent to kill Ram Koda and leave no witnesses, killing Imperials and Koda's men alike. Since neither people mentioned are a match for Starkiller realistically, let's skip right to the Starkiller vs Ram Koda boss fight. Spoilers, it's different to how the game presents it. At first glance, Ram Koda should be able to beat Starkiller, right? He's a war veteran who is older and more experienced than Starkiller. How did Starkiller beat him? Well, based on what the book describes, Ram Koda underestimated Starkiller, and Starkiller was also strategically looking for a weakness, specifically in the general's fighting style. And eventually, Ram Koda ended up showing his age and became weaker, and that's when Starkiller seized the opportunity, eventually locking sabers with him and blinding him. Now, Ram Koda survived the incident as we all know, but that's the second boss fight explained. Ram Koda lost because he underestimated Starkiller and overestimated his own strength despite his age. In fact, his true strength was being a general, not a direct lightsaber combatant. Alright. Next we've got Kazdan Paratus. Now I always found it plausible that Starkiller could defeat him, despite Vader telling him that Kazdan Paratus was more powerful than him. But for those who think Paratus should have won, I will explain everything in due time. I first wanted to note about the third level that those Scrap Guardians and Titans and whatnot that were powered by the Force, they were exclusive to the game. The novelization completely omits them, because as you might expect, they're unrealistic. Starkiller mostly came across Rhodian scrap gangs and regular droids. Eventually, when he confronts Kazdan Paratus, while he does surprise Starkiller with his mechanical attacks, he quickly adapts to his attacks. And since the Jedi Master is completely insane, he actually tries to use all the mannequins seen in the game to fight Starkiller. When Starkiller destroys each one, modeled after a member of the Jedi High Council, it weakens Kazdan Paratus more and more physically and mentally. It was an easy weakness Starkiller found and he exploited it. So that's the third boss fight over and done with. So then Starkiller is tasked with what Vader seems to consider a real challenge, Master Shaak Ti. At first this seems completely absurd now. How could Starkiller possibly beat a Jedi High Council member? Well, it was an extremely close match. Starkiller and Shaak Ti fought extremely close to the Sarlacc, stumbling both of them. And the novelization actually has Starkiller sustain non-lethal injuries from Shaak Ti, all before she gets impaled in the stomach by Starkiller's lightsaber. We get that conversation about how the Sith betray each other, and she dies. I also want to mention before we move on is that it's implied after the fact that she intended to have both of them killed at the same time, which indicates that she was holding back. Another inference one could make is how Shaak Ti went over a decade without a serious combat challenge like Starkiller, and hiding on Felucia may have been another factor. So point is, it was a close match. It's implied that she was holding back, and not dueling another opponent in over a decade led to Shaak Ti being defeated. Alright, so Starkiller doesn't really face any iffy challenges in the game for a while. He's stabbed in the back by Vader, launched out into space by the Emperor's command, and it takes at least 6 months to repair his body, which is something Filoni needs to take lessons from. It's worth noting that being repaired also gave him a boost up in strength, since some of his body has now become synthetic. A detail the book actually has is that he's forced to use Ram Koda's lightsaber now, since his old one was lost in deep space, and that's pretty much the saber he uses for the rest of the story. So yeah, he was actually using a green lightsaber for this mission and the mission after that, despite what the cutscenes show. Again, the game is not completely canonical, the novelization is. The novelization also doesn't have Starkiller come across Shadow or Purge troopers. They are game exclusive to provide enemy variety. Okay, so he recruits Ram Koda and he defeats the Shadow Guard guy. Well, actually in the novelization, he defeats two of them back to back. And I don't see anyone complain about him defeating the Shadow Guards. So let's move on. Kashyyyk, no extraordinary enemies are encountered. Ozek Stern does have an upgraded ATST, but that's about it. Starkiller does go up against a few ATSTs in the novelization, but that's a defeatable threat in my opinion. And in case you forgot, the less experienced Cal Kestis fought ATSTs in Fallen Order 2. So yeah. The next reasonable threat Starkiller comes across is the Bull Rancor commanded by Maris Brood when he's trying to free Bail Organa. Now the novelization also makes the Bull Rancor a close call, but I don't see anyone complain about the Bull Rancor. And then when the Bull Rancor's down, Maris soon follows. Then we get the part that makes people who take the game too literally scoff out the arse. But it's actually not as absurd canonically as the game presents it. Now, when Starkiller was sent to take down the Star Destroyer construction station, he hijacked a cannon to shoot the station, and it caused the Star Destroyer we see in the game to fall towards the surface due to gravity. Now keep in mind, the Star Destroyer was coming down anyways, with or without Starkiller. What Starkiller did was less overpowered than you think. He guided the Star Destroyer towards the cannon, and pretty much only altered its course by a few hundred meters at best. But he did eventually manage to pull towards where he wanted, but just barely. Yeah, so Starkiller didn't have as much control as you might think. Yoda or the Emperor could obviously do better than him in a situation, but it's still an impressive feat. In fact, Starkiller looks like this during the whole pull down the Star Destroyer thing. So the main takeaway is that Starkiller didn't pull down the Star Destroyer willy-nilly towards the ground. It was already falling down due to gravity, and Starkiller was at best nudging the fall towards the cannon that shot down the station in the first place. Now there's two more things that are worth talking about. First is the boss fight with Darth Vader. Now there was no way Starkiller was going to defeat Darth Vader with knowledge of the Force or with his skills with a lightsaber, and the novelization was fully aware of this. So how on earth did Starkiller defeat Darth Vader? Well, via Starkiller's arc throughout the whole story, after he was tricked to do his master's bidding before being discarded, Starkiller pretty much outwilled Vader. And what I mean by that is that he conquered his demons by the end. He exploited Vader's weakness of being a shell of a man encased inside a suit, and pretty much strategically taunted him. He pointed out how much of a slave he was to the Emperor, and so on and so forth. And that provoked Vader enough that it gave him an opening that he exploited to cut down his breathing system. And then from there, he was able to defeat him, damaging more and more of his systems, and a blast during the battle even forced open his mask, and Starkiller got to see the pathetic being that was trapped inside the suit. So yeah, Starkiller did not defeat Vader through conventional means, but rather by psychologically taunting him in the right spots. The way the book describes it, and how it ties to Starkiller's arc is actually pretty clever. Also, if anyone had the closest chance of understanding Darth Vader, aside from Obi-Wan Kenobi or the Emperor, it was Starkiller, who spent a lot of time training under Vader. It's more plausible than you think. The apprentice used his head instead of brute force, and was rewarded with a victory. Vader, on the other hand, was an agent of hate, and never used his head. As one might see from the films alone, he pretty much took his problems out on other people. Starkiller conquered his demons, while Vader could not. Alright, now with that being said, you might say that the final boss fight, the Emperor, is impossible for him to beat. And you're 100% right. That's why I'm here to explain that Starkiller never defeated the Emperor. Instead, the Emperor pretty much feigned defeat when Starkiller stepped in to save Ram Koda. And you know that whole thing where he held off the Emperor's Force Lightning long enough for everyone to escape? Yeah, well, I recall the book gave the impression that he managed to hold on for at least 10 seconds less than what the game showed. So bottom line, Starkiller never defeated the Emperor. In fact, the Emperor defeated him, although only in the short term, as Starkiller managed to save the rebellion and become a martyr. Now with all that cleared up, that's all the major complaints I hear. And as you can tell, it relates to the gameplay. I have heard miscellaneous complaints about the story of The Force Unleashed, but as you can see, all the big ones I have disputed. The Force Unleashed is not without some genuinely bad writing, but stuff like pulling down a Star Destroyer is not one of them. The Force Unleashed Novellisation, as I hear, was renowned and met with critical acclaim, so I'm not the only one who thinks the novelization is superb. You should really read it yourself. Now, I didn't really talk about the book like a review, maybe that'll come another time, but I just wanted to squash a bunch of the gameplay to story-based misconceptions created by people who only played the game or games, and took them so literally when it comes to canon. Starkiller is not overpowered. In fact, a key weakness of his that the book puts forth is his lack of foresight, which led to him being easily surprised. And also stuff like his fixation on what Darth Vader promised him, but he is certainly not a Larry Stu. As pointed out earlier, he had the most amount of training a character could within the time span of the two movies. And his arc was developed and completely earned. Yes, I know he was 17 or whatever, but the writers thought out this story more than one thinks. So hopefully, with those misconceptions debunked, this will hopefully promote real discussion about the story of The Force Unleashed. But probably not. There will still be some ignorant, filthy casual who keeps complaining about how Starkiller was able to pull down a Star Destroyer, and that person will probably never change. And JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying that the law is strong?